Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Or if anybody is having trouble with anything, just shoot me a question and we will get started in just a minute. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay. All right, so far it seems like everybody can hear me. All right, well, good morning. I'm glad that you guys have joined me today, and I hope that your social distancing or working from home situation is going well and isn't driving you completely up the wall yet. And I hope you're still finding ways to be productive at home if you are home, or if you're not, I hope that you're staying safe and being as well as you can. These are really uncertain and scary times, but the fact that you're here ready for this webinar is one of the many ways I know that we are all still working together and that we will get through this together. So I'll start by telling you all, I think the webinar says that the speaker is Christina. I'm not Christina, I'm Chloe. I work for the Tennessee Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. I'm a program specialist. Previously, I worked under the rural grant at a domestic violence shelter in East Tennessee, and specifically, I worked with LGBTQ+ and male sexual assault survivors. And before that, I led an after-school group for LGBTQ+ youth in my hometown in Eastern Kentucky. So as long as I have been working, I have always focused on this marginalized group, and it has truly encouraged me to see that so many people signed up for this webinar. And so I will begin by telling you what I hope, what I hope this presentation will accomplish. So first we will talk about the prevalence rates and some of the characteristics of intimate partner violence in LGBTQ+ relationships. So what that looks like and what we know of how often it happens, even though some of the statistics and studies aren't as thorough as we would like and don't happen as often. The studies don't happen as often as we would like. But we will also discuss some of the barriers that LGBTQ+ folks have when seeking support for intimate partner violence. This will hopefully deepen our understanding of how being LGBTQ+ affects the experience of a survivor of sexual violence or intimate partner violence. And lastly, we will discuss the similarities and difference in experiences for the for sexuality and gender as separate. And this is important because those two are often lumped together, and we even put them together in the LGBT, whereas LGB are sexual orientations and T is a gender identity. So while those experiences are similar, they're also different, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. And so we will start with some of the basic terminology. This is stuff you know, this might be stuff you don't know, but either way, we're going to start here because I'm going to be saying this acronym at least 300 times during this presentation. So I want us all to be on the same page, and we need to know exactly what it is that I'm referring to. So the L in LGBTQIA is lesbian. This is a woman who feels romantically, emotionally, and sexually attracted to other women. The G is gay, a man who feels romantic, emotional, and sexual attraction to other men. The B is bisexual, and I want to clarify that this does not mean attraction to both male and female genders, because that is sticking to the binary that we're kind of going to try to get away from. So most people are under this impression, and that's okay. I thought this originally for the longest time. You hear bi, you think two, and it does sort of still stand for two. So it's two attractions in that it is both the same sex of the individual as well as another gender apart from the individual's gender, or another sex apart from the individual's sex. Does that make sense? So it's the same sex and another sex, not male and female. Because again, we want to get away from that binary, because that segues perfectly into the T. The T is transgender. This is an umbrella term for anyone who does not identify with their biological sex. So someone can be male to female transgender, female to male transgender, or any other gender which does not follow that binary. So whatever that looks like for the individual. This is different than a cisgender, of course, which is someone whose gender identity is in alignment with the sex they were assigned at birth. And the Q stands for two different terms, queer and questioning. Formerly, this queer was a derogatory slur and not an identity, but recently the LGBTQ plus community is taking it back and reclaiming it as an identity. And it just means it's that umbrella term for anyone who is unsure of one's sexual orientation and or gender identity, but hasn't felt comfortable with or is unwilling or unable to self-categorize with traditional labels such as gay, straight, male, female, etc. And then you have I for intersex, and an intersex individual has some degree of ambiguity in regard to primary sex characteristics, so either physically or physiologically, hormonally. This is another umbrella type term in that there isn't one way to be intersex, and not all intersex folks are transgender, which is a common misunderstanding. The A is for asexual. This is someone who doesn't feel sexual attraction for anyone, though they may feel a romantic attraction. And the plus is everyone else. You have two-spirit, which is a Native American term for a gender variant outside of the binary. You have pansexual, genderqueer, gender fluid, demisexual, and a host of other identities. The point being, we don't get to tell someone their identity is invalid just because we don't understand it or know about it. As well, because we live in such a heteronormative cisgender world, which labels everyone and puts them into these boxes of gender and sexual orientation. And so what, we learn this from such an early age. We learn that binary from such an early age, right? We're taught in high school, maybe middle school for some, that there are two sets of chromosomes. There's XX for females and there's XY for males. And we're not taught about intersex who can have XX chromosomes but male genitalia or vice versa. Additionally, we're taught that these bodies have rules. So if you will, type into the chat box or question box that you have and throw me some of these rules. So what are the rules men or boys are taught to follow from the get-go, from birth? What are some of the rules that we're taught we're supposed to be following? Right, I'm seeing emotion, men bring home the bacon. Weakness, don't act like a girl. Don't cry, boys can't play with dolls. Man up. Yep. Boys have to wear blue. Boys don't cry, not emotional. Yep. Yeah, suck it up. Yep, throw some dirt on it. I heard that a lot growing up with some of the boys I've played with. So yeah, so these are all great and all valid and things, clearly all things that we have heard before, right? Yeah, men are stronger than women physically and emotionally because men don't show emotion, of course, so they have to be stronger than women. Right, so these are some of the rules that boys have to follow. What about women? What are some of the rules that women and girls are told that they have to follow? Stay at home with the babies, kids, raise your kids, be feminine, act like a lady. Don't be assertive, don't be bossy. Yeah. The man works, the woman doesn't. Don't speak up. Be quiet. Yep. Being ladylike. I like that ladylike is in quotations because what even? Be ladylike in posture. Yes. Women are too emotional. Be seen and not heard. Cook clean, do your job. Oh, let the boy fry the bacon. Men bring home the bacon and women fry the bacon. Exactly. That is what we're taught from an early age even. Let men handle the problem. Yes. So we have all these unspoken, thank you guys so much. These were really, really great responses. So thank you all. And we have these unspoken, understood rules, right? And then we have these out loud, don't you dare deviate from them rules too. And you don't have to type this into the chat box. I'm gonna take this one. But so what happens when someone violates these rules? They're outcast. They're seen as weird. They're an abomination even. They're socially isolated, abused, victimized, harassed, discriminated against. All sorts of things just because they don't fit into a box of what someone else says gender should look like. So the bottom line is they're treated differently. And that's what it boils down to, isn't it? When you really think about it, it's boiled down to we treat people how we treat them based off of their gender. So I want you to check out this comic by my friend Melissa Helton. It starts with a new mother. It starts with a new mother holding her baby. Another woman comes up and asks the name, then assumes it's a boy because she says Taylor. And then look at her language. Oh, such a strong, big, strong little man. And she says, no, it's not a boy. She says, oh, sorry, look at the precious angel princess. She says, well, not a girl either. And the woman says, okay, is it a boy or girl? Mom says, they haven't chosen a gender yet. They haven't told us. The woman says, what was it born as? The mom says, human. The woman says, what kind? The mom says, Gemini. The woman says, is the baby male or female? Her mom says, we haven't tested chromosomes or hormones. They might be intersex. And the woman's frustrated, says, Jesus, what does its body look like? And the mom says, why do you want to know what my baby's genitals look like? And the woman says, so I know how to treat it. And this comic might be a little, out there, or might be, whatever, but it stands true in that why did she need to know? Because that's how she's going to treat it. She's going to treat that infant differently based on its gender. And that's just where we are. So because we are taught, this binary, we know what to do with the binary, but we don't know what to do with the stuff that falls outside of the binary. Gender nonconformity is disruptive to that binary, and it thrives on sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and heteronormativity. Gender doesn't just rule how we treat each other, gender rules everything. Think about how many times a day we gender someone: waitress, waiter, Mrs., Mr., boyfriend, girlfriend. We color code with pink and blues. That woman's entire attitude towards an infant was based on its gender. So why is this important for us to know? Why is this important to this topic? Well, folks live with limited and traditional ideas about sex, gender, and orientation. And because these traditional ideologies do not favor the LGBTQ plus community or even include them, queer folks suffer from those traditional views. These traditional views are that a person's gender and sex are the same thing, and or that folks should only date and marry the opposite sex. And so they make assumptions of those around them based off of these traditions. The assumptions are what hurt LGBTQ plus folks every day. And they're also where most ideas on homophobia and transphobia stem from. These anti-LGBTQ plus biases and negative assumptions create obstacles for queer and trans survivors who are seeking access to services, support, self-determination, and supportive housing. And you'll hear me say intimate partner violence mostly through this. I won't use domestic violence as often through this specific training. And let me tell you why. So the definition of intimate partner violence is harm perpetuated by a former or current partner or spouse. Most of us here use the term domestic violence more than we do IPV, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just for the sake of this training, I'm going to use IPV because traditionally, domestic violence has been investigated from a traditional heteronormative view of gender, wherein the perpetrator is male and the victim is female. And the views of men in our society, some of the things you guys mentioned earlier, be strong, don't show emotion, take care of the women. They're supposed to be the strong, unemotional, man of the house, tough. These stereotypes make male victims more hesitant to come forward already. So coupled with that stigma attached Couple that with the stigma attached to the words domestic violence. Awareness campaigns, offender treatment programs, victim support services. You know, you still hear battered women's shelter, especially back in the day. You didn't hear battered men's shelter as often, if at all. And it's because these programs are more often than not developed according to traditional views of domestic violence. And we may even say, yes, but women are victims more often than men. And yes, that is true by all statistics that we have, but the numbers are not hugely different. According to the CDC, 40% of women are victims of intimate partner violence in the state of Tennessee, and 32.4% of men are victims of intimate partner violence in Tennessee. And yes, there's a difference, but that's a 7.6. I'm really bad at math, but I don't think I can do that much. That's not a huge percentage difference. And because the numbers for men and women are the ones we most often see, because we live in this very binary world, we can sometimes forget about the rates of our LGBTQ plus victims. The rates of IPV range from 25 to 50% in gay and lesbian relationships. And I will talk about that more in just a little bit. And the lifetime prevalence rates of victimization for transgender folks is between 31.3 and 50%. And unfortunately, there aren't as many statistics or aren't as many studies even about sexual and gender minority groups outside of LG and T. For instance, bisexual numbers tend to be amalgamated into LGBT studies. But what we do know with what statistics we do have is that the numbers of IPV cases are just as common within the LGBTQ plus relationships, if not more so, and yet these cases of IPV are underreported. So one of the reasons for underreporting IPV in the LGBTQ plus community is that they experience the same types of abuse as those in non-LGBTQ plus relationships. Some experiences are unique to them, and the most commonly used tactic is outing or threatening to out their partner, the victim. The abuser will say, your mom doesn't know, and if she did, she'd disown you. So if you leave, I'll tell her you're a lesbian. Or even the court system isn't going to let a gay man keep his children by himself. I'll out you in front of the judge if you try to leave and take the kids. I've had victims tell me those exact things were said to them. So the abuse for the LGBTQ plus community is typically targeted at their sexuality or their gender. So outing is a big one. And then what are some of the other reasons why LGBTQ plus folks are less likely to report? Specifically in the state of Tennessee, Senate Bill 1556 was passed, which says, under the bill, no counselor or therapist shall be required to serve a client as to goals, outcomes, or behaviors that conflict with a sincerely held religious belief of the counselor, provided an appropriate referral is made. So under those state regulations, a counselor or therapist is potentially subject to discipline for referring a client whose goals and desired outcomes conflict with a counselor's religious beliefs, even if the counselor lacks the competence to treat such a patient. And then we also have the Tennessee House Bill 835 in effect, which bars the state from denying an agency's license or grant application for public funds, for taxpayer funds, because of a refusal to place a child with a family based on religious objections. It allows child welfare organizations to turn away qualified Tennesseans seeking to care for a child in need, including LGBTQ plus couples, interfaith couples, single parents, married couples in which one prospective parent has previously been divorced, or other parents to whom the agency has a religious objection. So you have the whole state proving time and again that they do not support the LGBTQ plus community. Then you have shelters that are women and children only, or shelters that say they're inclusive, say that they are not just women and children shelters, but don't supply the right supplies or resources, or don't house everyone in the same shelter, or there are some discrepancies there. Or you have shelters that are religious, and while they don't outright discriminate against the LGBTQ plus community, but they have that religious stigma attached to them. LGBTQ plus folks are not going to come to those because historically religious organizations have not been LGBTQ plus friendly. So then all that aside, let's say an LGBTQ plus victim does break through those barriers and gets into a shelter. Well, now what? Now they get in there and run the risk of being re-traumatized by service providers who haven't had time to learn which healthcare providers in their area are LGBTQ plus friendly, or haven't had time to learn the inclusive language, or haven't had to serve an LGBTQ plus victim before this. They don't know who specializes in trans medicine or who are sensitive to their needs. So then the victim is faced with either having to educate their own provider on LGBTQ plus sensitivities or just not knowing what services are available to them. And the service provider is at a disadvantage too, because now they'll have to spend additional time re-educating themselves, and this is probably time they don't have, and it's definitely time that they're taking away from survivors. So then they're facing a lack of representation in the shelter or within the service agency. No one there looks like them or is there to specifically advocate for their needs. The victims are also facing gendered intake packets that might not have the correct option for their gender, or the paperwork has feminine pronouns on it. If they're not out, they might have a fear of being outed in a whole new place where their living situation is unpredictable and unstable. They also might not feel comfortable coming out to their advocate or case manager for fear of rejection, because what if those service providers then put their needs on the back burner because they don't know how to help them, or they provide inadequate services, or worse, they lose those services due to prejudice or bias. So a million fears are running through their heads, and more often than not, service providers are not as equipped as they want to be, or they don't feel they need to be explicitly inclusive from the outset. And even if they are, most LGBTQ plus victims aren't aware that there are services for them, or that the services that are already available will receive them equally. And then transgender victims also face some unique tactics from their abusers. Transgender individuals may change their name, but they may not always have the resources to change their name on documentation like IDs and birth certificates. So abusers will dead name them. This means that the abuser will purposefully call them the wrong name or by their birth name, by the birth name of the victim, which does not align with their gender identity. Transgender folks may seek medical interventions such as hormones and surgery to make their bodies as congruent as possible with their identified gender. Abusers may delegitimize the victim's identity, saying things like, "You're not a real man, you have to take testosterone to be a man." Abusers may also deny them access to those medical necessities, either by hiding the medication itself or withholding funds to obtain it, not letting them use the car to go get it, whatever that looks like. Abusers may also hide the tools that enable the individual to express their gender identity, their chest binders, the clothes that suit their gender, or they make fun of their clothes. They may also isolate the individual and manipulate the victim's families by spreading lies about the victim's identity. They may also financially abuse the transgender victim because the victim has been discriminated against in the job place by either losing a job or not being able to find one in the first place. It also is important to note here that some transgender individuals may also not want to seek medical interventions and may decide on changing their gender expression via their clothing or expressing their gender expression with changing their pronoun or their name. They may not always choose the medical route. And this is why it is important that we do not assume a person's gender identity, because it is beneath the surface. So aside from all the same reasons that the general LGBTQ plus community is less likely to report, transgender victims are less likely to report for specific reasons unique to them. One of those is kind of a weird thing that's good but bad. So focus on intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ plus community is increasing and being more inclusive, and that's great, we want that. But in doing so, some of those efforts are being aimed at including sexual orientation. Gender identity is being put on the back burner. And okay, like, yes, it's on the stove at all, and that's an improvement, but it's not good enough and it's not where we need to be. And there's huge stigma attached with the LGB population, but the negative stigma towards transgender folks is even greater. This makes accessing more challenging. There is a lack of medical education among clinicians. There are many trans persons who are not comfortable disclosing their identity. Male to female transgender clients might not pass enough for women's organizations. This is they don't appear as what society thinks women should look like, and therefore are soon to be men and don't qualify for those services. Female to male transgender clients risk further victimizations within male shelters or co-ed shelters, where they have to hide their gender identity to access female shelters. They may also be reluctant to disclose their gender identity because they will further be discriminated against or further victimized. They may be hesitant to go through court proceedings because their documentation is still in their dead name, and many medical intakes are not pronoun and gender inclusive. So an example, you have a client named Mark that has been sexually assaulted. He goes to the hospital and the front desk takes his driver's license. Well, his driver's license still is his dead name, Mary. So the receptionist has his sign-in name as Mark, but his paperwork says Mary, and copies of his insurance and his license say Mary. So when the triage nurse gets his info, she sees Mary on paper, but sees Mark in front of her. And so she's confused, she's fumbling around, she doesn't know what to call him. And there isn't a place on the paperwork for her to ask. And it's not that she's biased or even prejudiced, but she's thrown off because she wasn't prepared for it. And she's seeing these two different conflicting documents, right? So Mark's now even more uncomfortable. So then the doctor gets to him, and the doctor has to ask questions specifically relating to his genitalia because of the way rape kits must be documented. So you can see now that 3 times, not only has Mark had to tell his story, but he's had to also defend his identity, to assert his identity, to say his pronouns, to possibly explain why these two things are different, and face implicit or even possibly explicit bias. And I think we're all understanding of why folks choose not to come forward with sexual assaults or intimate partner violence cases. So knowing all that, it's easier for us to understand why a trans person would be extremely reluctant to come forward. And so why does this matter? Why is this important to understand these specifics? Why do we need to know the specific ways in which LGBTQ plus victims are discriminated against in the sexual violence or intimate partner violence world? So a National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs and the National Center on Victims of Crime report found that there were 3 main issues service providers had when serving LGBTQ plus victims. The first is a lack of specific outreach. So 69 to 92% of respondents lacked LGBTQ plus specific outreach materials or strategies. The second one is a lack of LGBTQ plus training. 63 to 93% of respondents stated a lack of training as their biggest challenge in serving LGBTQ plus survivors, with the highest need being training to work with trans-identified survivors. And then lastly, they reported a lack of LGBTQ plus collaborative links. 43% of sexual assault and intimate partner violence service providers and 78% of prosecutors' offices reported that they had no partnership with a local or even regional LGBTQ plus organization. And even aside from that, 85% of advocates say that they worked with a survivor who was denied services because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so on the victims level, why does understanding this matter? So victims will face these interpersonal attacks, these hate crimes, this targeted violence. They face these statewide discrimination and anti-LGBTQ plus harassment bills. Their families have often rejected them. Their partners have rejected them. Their partners have abused them. They're profiled. They experience higher rates of sexual violence. They experience all these attacks that are personal. They're personal to their very character, to their identity. And so they internalize these beliefs that the world has about them. They start holding negative beliefs about themselves, about their own identity, because on a personal, cultural, and institutional level, they are receiving messages that tell them to hate themselves or that there is something wrong with them. And this self-hate, this oppression results in the victims not getting the care that they want or need. And because of this, they may also not feel comfortable sharing their full history with their service provider. And then because of this, some service providers may misinterpret this vagueness or the gaps in the story as the victim being non-compliant, problematic, or uncooperative. Because they don't know all the details, service providers may not be able to offer appropriate safety planning. They may not know the correct gender of the victim and therefore not able to refer them to. Someone just said the audio is not working. Is everyone still able to hear me? Okay, sorry. All right. Okay, good. We're back. All right. Thank you guys. So they may not know the correct gender of the victim and therefore not able to refer them to the right programs. As well, LGBTQ plus people who have not communicated their story to their service provider is less likely to trust what a service provider says or suggests to them because they know that they haven't told them the full story. So we focused a lot on general IPV, but how does intimate partner violence intersect with sexual violence? So LGBTQ plus survivors, like so many survivors of intimate partner violence, experience high rates of sexual violence as part of the controlling and coercive behavior on the part of the abuser. LGBTQ plus survivors of intimate partner violence may also experience hate violence by their partner or by society at large, and hate violence often includes components of sexual violence, including corrective rape, wherein we saw this a lot in my hometown with incest, sadly. And LGBTQ plus survivors also experience sexual violence on the street, from new dates, from people they met at the bar, from strangers during sex work. And these are not unlike experience that heterosexual or non-LGBTQ plus survivors have, but LGBTQ plus survivors experience these at a higher rate. And according to research, LGBT people are at approximately the same risk as heterosexuals of being sexually assaulted by someone they know. But they're at a higher risk for sexual violence, stalking, and harassment. So 47% of transgender victims of sexual violence, or 47% of transgender individuals are survivors of sexual violence. 44% of lesbians, 61% of bisexual women, compared to 35% of straight women. And then you have 26% of gay men, 37% of bisexual men, compared to 29% of straight men. So as we can see, transgender folks and bisexual women face the most alarming rates of sexual violence. As well, among both of those populations, the sexual violence begins early, often in childhood. So then we want to look at why. Why are LGBTQ plus numbers higher than those of heterosexual numbers? So folks in the LGBTQ plus community are already seen as outsiders. They're seen as sexual deviants, as going against the grain of what is normal. You can't see me, but I put air quotes around normal. They're scapegoated as perpetrators of sexual violence. Gay men carry a huge stigma attached to pedophilia. The homophobia and heterosexism in our culture puts LGBTQ plus people at greater risk for sexual violence. It's common for perpetrators to use sexual violence as a way to punish and humiliate someone for being LGBTQ plus. A common example of this is someone who thinks that they can change a woman's sexual orientation, specifically targeting lesbians and bisexual women. There are a lot of myths surrounding sexual violence in the LGBTQ plus community. We touched on a couple of them, but there are more, of course, that gay men are stereotyped as promiscuous, that lesbians are stereotyped as being asexual, that LGBTQ plus relationships are inherently abusive because they involve weird sexual practices or BDSM. Men can't be raped. A woman can't be raped by another woman. Lesbians can be converted. People are gay because of bad experiences in their childhood or adolescence with the opposite sex. And these myths and stereotypes about LGBTQ+ people make it more difficult to report sexual violence they experience. So what does this look like for us? What does this mean for us, the supportive services or service providers? LGBTQ+ survivors of violence may not have obtained the culturally competent services they needed previously in response to having experienced violence, and may therefore not be considered eligible for supportive housing. So because they don't have proof that they were in a domestic violence situation or an intimate partner violence situation, they're not eligible for supportive housing, for transitional housing or safe housing. And even once in supportive housing, LGBTQ+ individuals continue to face discrimination, bias, and violence from neighbors, landlords, even service providers, and they may require additional transitional services or services at an outreach capacity once they leave a shelter or exit a certain program. And you all don't have to type this in, but just think about it individually to yourselves. What issues and challenges do LGBTQ+ domestic violence and sexual assault and intimate partner violence victims or survivors in your community face? What can you do? And think about this, really think about this, because the thing here is that LGBTQ+ victim services will look very different here in Nashville than they do in rural East Tennessee or Eastern Kentucky, where I'm from. I'm from a town where we had to drive over an hour and a half to get to the nearest LGBTQ+ friendly bar to watch drag shows. My apartment here in Nashville is 15 minutes from an LGBTQ youth center. So these services and these collaborative partners are going to look different for each of you. And as such, I do want to tell you that my contact information will be at the end of this presentation. And I want you to reach out to me with any questions or concerns you have about this. I want to help you brainstorm, help you find resources, whatever you need. I'd love to help you out because I do know that this kind of assistance for LGBTQ+ survivors looks different depending on your personal community. You may live in a progressive community. You may live in a very rural, traditional, conservative community. And so you may have different needs. But there are a few things that all of us can do to make our LGBTQ+ victims feel more included, safer, more comfortable while receiving our services. So we can create a safe environment for LGBTQ+ victims, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. But, we want to be able to understand that they have different needs. They might want different support groups. What support group you think that they should go into may look very different to them and maybe different from what they feel that they belong in. So it's important for you to know that. It's important for you to have appropriate and queer-friendly information and referrals on hand. Do not assume that every victim you come into contact with is heterosexual. Don't assume that every victim you come into contact with is LGBTQ+ either, but just don't assume anything would probably be the underlying lesson there. Because you're going to have different questions, you're going to have different things that you need to do. So don't assume anything of the gender or sexual orientation or expression that you have or that an individual has when they come into your organization. As with all victims or survivors, don't pressure the survivor to file a police report or follow up on legal action or to even seek to have a rape kit done. You want to encourage these things. You want to encourage them to do what they feel is best for their situation. But especially when you have an LGBTQ+ survivor, you don't want to pressure them to file because of the things we talked about earlier. Their documentation may be different or whatever that looks like. So respect an LGBTQ+ survivor's individuality. Don't offer them the wrong types of clothing. Encourage them to express themselves how they feel they should express themselves. Do not minimize their fears or concerns. If a transgender person comes into your shelter, let's say it's a female to male transgender person and they have fears because they are female to male transgender, don't delegitimize them. Those fears are completely valid, but do ensure that they have a safety plan with them, in that you are encouraging them that they know what is best for them, that they know what they need. And of course, advocate for all victims of domestic and sexual violence. When you're doing your outreach, when you're doing your tabling events, when you're doing whatever, advocate for all victims. And so this doesn't just mean your heterosexual victims. This is everyone. Make sure that your tables include representation. Make sure that your pamphlets include representation. Another thing, of course, how to be an ally in the field. So remember that it's not about you. If an LGBTQ person has come into your facility, they're already at a disadvantage. They're already feeling out of place. So get out of your own head and don't make it about you. Put your discomfort aside, put your awkwardness aside as best you can, because trust me, I am a super awkward person, and I know that I can't always control how awkward I am, but do your best, and especially do your best for LGBTQ plus victims. And just remember that you can make the difference here. Remember that there is a difference between diversity and inclusion. Diversity is an idea, inclusion is an action. So the way that you respond to underserved populations in the context of your field shapes your ability to serve. And I can tell you from a lot of my experience across the state that working with LGBTQ populations in shelters, in intimate partner violence, service provider settings is still a very noteworthy thing. And so some of these experiences are specific to residential services. But for instance, bringing a male survivor into shelter or housing a transgender client is still something that is seen as out of the ordinary. And one of the things you can also do here is when you get an interesting case that features someone from an underserved population, sometimes your go-to can be to talk about it. So telling your coworkers, hey, we've got a trans person coming in, or trying to overly prepare other folks in your program or residence that a male or an LGBTQ plus person is coming in. And what this does is set the tone that there is something to be anxious about, or that people in your facility have the right to be worried or confused or at attention, and that you might not be confident in your ability to handle the person in front of you as just a person needing services. So go out of your way to not share anything about your clients more than you need to with other staff members, and definitely check your urge to discuss anything beyond the essentials for delivering services to that client. Another way to remain an ally is to keep educating yourself. Seek out queer media, seek out current events, stay up to date with what laws are going on in the current state that you're in. If you're in Kentucky, if you're in Tennessee, wherever you're in, make sure that you know what laws are going on. And make yourself extremely aware of exclusionary language. So there's some examples listed here, but I'm sure there are a million more. So for instance, in past years, it's been encouraged to ask a person or patient or client, what pronouns do you prefer? And then some studies came out recently that said, hey, this is still perpetuating that their identity is some sort of choice. So now we say, what pronouns do you use? Making sure this is on your intake package. I even was at a facility in Memphis recently that when you signed in, you wrote your name, your preferred name, and your pronouns down, and it was on a label sticker so that the receptionist could just peel it off and stick it on the front of my file, so that when I went back to meet with this person, they already knew what to call me. And that would have been a huge relief to a transgender person who probably already did not want to be there. And that's an extra level of inclusion that makes them feel safe and cared for. And so creating that safe environment that I mentioned earlier. So there are several fairly easy steps that you can take to make the client environment a welcoming one for LGBTQ plus people. So first, intake is a good opportunity to make sure that victims of all sexual and gender identities feel included and welcome. Intake forms, for example, will ideally have questions that allow options beside male and female. For example, you might want to include male to female transgender or female to male transgender intersex, other, or I've even seen some places leave it completely open-ended for gender. And sometimes that can cause problems because the survivor might leave it blank. So possibly be wary about doing that, but it's not an option. The form should also allow for different sexual orientations and relationship status. So with gender neutral language, you want it to say partner, not partner or spouse, not husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend. And always state that the information that you have to ask of the victims is used to ensure that they are receiving comprehensive trauma-informed care. Explain that they can that some questions are skippable if they are. Of course, you know your grant guidelines, you know what you have to report on. And since some victims have concerns about the accessibility of information to insurers or employers or others, it's helpful to state explicitly that all information is confidential and will not be released without consent. I know you all do that anyway, but it's extra helpful for LGBTQ plus folks because they have different concerns with their identity. Non-discrimination policies that include sexual and gender minorities can be posted in the waiting room and exam rooms. If you have questions on how to rewrite those or how to create them, please email me. I am more than happy to help you figure some of those out. Unisex bathrooms. Having unisex bathrooms ensures that transgender patients do not have to choose between that binary, that they are free to go where they need to go and be where they need to be. And having that unisex bathroom might seem like a little thing, but it's a huge thing, actually. So those are some of the things that we can do. We can talk about a million more things, but these are the basic things that everyone can do. And like I said, depending on your own community, which you know better than I do, there are other things that you might be able to do. So I do want you to email me with questions that you have about that. And so in conclusion, the big takeaway here, if you get nothing else out of this session, I want you to remember this. Remember these beautiful words by Maya Angelou, is that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you make them feel. When you are in that advocate's role, that service provider's role, you are more often than not the only person standing between an LGBTQ plus victim and their access to comfortability and safety when it comes to victim services. You set the tone for them. You create the shelter culture, the office culture, the program culture. You have the ability to create safety and trauma-informed practices and all-inclusive practices for these victims. And the change always starts with you. So always keep that in mind, that you are the change. And then I have my list of references and resources here for those of you that want these additionally. And I do believe that this webinar is going to be accessible on YouTube. So if you need these references again, they'll be there. Of course, if you're looking at them right now, you can jot them down, keep them on your own file. The bottom one that says NCADV, I have that as a PDF file saved, so I can send that to you, of course, if you want to. I should have uploaded it as a handout, and of course I did not, but definitely should have done that in hindsight. And then, like I promised, here is my contact information. That is my, that's the coalition number. You can call that and ask to speak to me. And then my email is also at the bottom. So I am trying to get my questions to pop up so that you guys can ask me questions if you would like, but I'm having trouble seeing all the questions again. Give me 1 second. Okay, so if you have a question, if you want to add it into the question box, we've got about 20 minutes, or not, sorry, whoa. like I said, bad at math. We've got about 10 minutes for questions if you would like to ask me some. Okay, I don't see any questions popping up. Oh, okay, here we go. Now I can see all the questions. Okay, so will this PowerPoint be emailed later? I believe so, but if you want to send me an email just to make sure that I get that to you, we can do that. So I am an advocate on a military base, and when I do displays, the chaplains on base will not allow LGBTQ plus materials to be put out. How would you handle this? The military is a tricky surface terrain that I am not familiar with at all, if I'm being completely honest, especially when it comes to LGBTQ plus information. So if you will let me research that, I can absolutely get back to you. I know a little about it, but I don't know enough to feel comfortable answering this question, just because I don't want to tell you the wrong thing in complete transparency. So I will, if you will email me this, Cheryl, I will get back to you. I appreciate that. That's very nice. Is there any way we can email about intake form ideas? Yes, absolutely. Email me and I will talk to you about that personally. Do you feel the reason we don't have as many reports of bisexual victims is because of bi erasure of bi individuals in hetero passing relationships being lumped in as DV and hetero? Absolutely, 100%. I will get on a soapbox about bi erasure all day. And so the question here is that bi erasure is this idea of if you see a man and a woman walking down the street holding hands, your automatic assumption is that they are straight, that they are a heterosexual couple, and that completely erases the idea of them being bisexual. So I do believe that we don't have as many reports of bisexual victims because of that, and because bi individuals can pass for heterosexuals. And so those numbers are often lumped into heterosexual domestic violence statistics. I do appreciate though, however, that the Human Rights Campaign and a few others have started, when they're doing their statistical analyses and when they're doing their reports, they are specifically asking for bisexual numbers. And that's only sort of recently started, so that's I'm really glad about that. So what are some ways that we can make sure we are coming across as LGBTQ plus friendly over the phone when speaking with victims? That's really great. So I did have someone else ask me this sort of in a way recently, that said that, you know, when they're on the phone with their victim and they're asking these questions about their gender or about their name or information, you know, some of the questions themselves seem kind of, I don't want to say rude, but they seem not inclusive. So how do you make sure? And what I told her was just that always upfront be like, you know, I know that this question may be awkward for you or uncomfortable, and I'm sorry, but I have to ask it because of our grant purposes, or I have to ask it because of paperwork policies. But I don't want you to in any way take this as our organization being non-LGBTQ plus friendly. I think that that's the big takeaway, is that you can just keep reiterating how LGBTQ friendly your organization is. And you can do that in one way, especially by one of the very first questions that you ask being, what pronouns do you use? Non-LGBTQ plus friendly places primarily do not ask that question. So if you're asking that question, you're letting them know from the get-go that you are LGBTQ plus friendly. And that is usually a pretty great way. And then if you are sensing that they've gotten, if they're uncomfortable, or if that, maybe if you've said the wrong thing, if you're picking up on that, it's okay to address that in a way of saying, I'm sorry if I'm coming across as this way or that way. I'm not meaning to. I just need to ask this question for whatever purposes. And just treat them like you would any other victim or survivor, with the exclusion that they have different needs, just like every other survivor has different needs. And of course, if you have any additional questions, you can reach out to me. I do have stats. Oh, do I have any stats for the counties in Tennessee? I do not have stats for the counties in Tennessee. Someone else actually asked me that recently, and I don't. There are some for Davidson County, but especially some of the rural counties, I know that those statistics are not there. But of course, if you want to email me, that way that I have your email, and then if I come across any, I can always send them to you so that you have those. Is there any way we can get the graphic that your friend designed about the new baby and gender? Absolutely. She was absolutely tickled when I asked her if I could include this on my presentation. So I'm sure that she would love to have more fame and notoriety, as she says. Ha, ha, ha. So yes, if you will email me and ask for that, I will send that to you. And she also has some other really cool graphics that have to do with gender and sexuality that I can send you. So, okay, does anyone else have any questions? We've got about 5 minutes. And I appreciate a lot of you had just comments that were very nice and encouraging. So thank you for doing that. I appreciate those kind words of encouragement. I will not be sending a quiz or test, but I will be sending a survey. It may not come from me, but it will come from someone at the coalition. So yes, you will get a survey. I don't know about certificates specifically. I imagine yes. And if you need one specifically, I hesitate to say yes just because I'm not for sure, but probably. So again, you'll get the survey, and then that should include something that says that you did take this webinar. So, but if you need additional affirmation or additional, yes, okay, I just got a text. Yes to certificate, you will get a certificate. I'll stop rambling. Thank you all so much for the compliments and kind words of encouragement. I appreciate that. And if you have any other questions, or you have questions about trainings, if you liked this training and need it at your organization specifically, if you're in the state of Tennessee, I can come to your organization once this travel ban recommendation is lifted, and once social distancing is not a concern as much anymore. I can come to your organization and do this training or similar trainings. And of course, if you email me, I can email you more about all that information. But okay, looks like we don't have any more questions, and we're almost out of time. So I will go ahead and close out. I thank you all so much for coming. We were at max capacity like 5 minutes before this even started. So thank you. And I hope you all have a great day and stay safe out there, and go wash your hands. Leave this right now and go wash your hands. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.